If you removed the promise of paradise and the fear of hell, would you still love God? It's a provocative question, one that exposes an uncomfortable truth about the human condition. Most people claim to love Allah, but that love often depends on outcomes, divine reward, security, or emotional peace. In practice, much of what we call love of God is a subtle form of negotiation, a transaction between the self and the sacred. Psychologically, this reflects a universal pattern. Human motivation is largely conditional. We pursue what gives pleasure and avoid what threatens pain. Even spiritual devotion, then, can become an extension of the same conditioning worship as emotional insurance. But Imam Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali proposed something far more radical. He claimed that true love of God begins only when the self no longer seeks benefit. To love Allah for His essence, not His gifts, is to transcend the psychology of exchange. The question that follows is profound. Can the human mind genuinely love without self-interest? Modern spirituality operates much like a marketplace. Faith is often expressed through a system of expected returns. Believe to be blessed, pray to attract, give to receive. The logic of material exchange quietly governs even our most sacred acts in behavioral psychology. This is called extrinsic motivation, behavior driven by external rewards or avoidance of punishment. When actions are tied to reward, the sense of autonomy and authenticity decreases. The same principle applies to spiritual life. When belief becomes instrumental, it loses depth. We perform actions not because they reveal truth, but because they promise control. In this sense, religion can mirror consumer psychology. I give devotion, I get protection. Yet Al-Ghazali saw the danger in this logic nearly 1,000 years ago. Worship guided by self-interest does not dissolve the ego, it reinforces it. The believer remains centered on the self, my faith, my salvation, my peace, as long as worship revolves around reward. The self remains the true object of devotion. Al-Ghazali lived in the 11th century, an era of intellectual expansion and theological debate. In his Ulum al-Din, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, he analyzed the psychology of worship. With surgical precision, he identified 3 developmental stages of faith: the worship of the slave, driven by fear of punishment; the worship of the merchant, driven by desire for reward; the worship of the lover, driven solely by recognition of divine reality. Only the third represents authentic faith, love for God's essence, not for what God gives, reveals genuine knowledge of the divine. Intrinsic motivation, acting for its own inherent satisfaction, leads to greater fulfillment, creativity, and stability. Similarly, in spirituality, when the act itself becomes the reward, the believer reaches maturity. Loving God for nothing is the ultimate autotelic state of the soul. At the core of Al-Ghazali's philosophy lies a simple but profound law. Love naturally follows knowledge. You love whatever you perceive as beautiful, virtuous, or perfect. Love, in this sense, is the mind's natural response to perceived perfection, to love. God is not an act of emotional intensity, but of accurate perception. God, being the perfection of all perfections, becomes the ultimate object of love once the intellect sees clearly. When the heart perceives divine perfection, desire for paradise becomes irrelevant. Love arises spontaneously. One does not love truth because it is useful. One loves it because falsity feels inherently discordant. When consciousness truly perceives God's reality, love becomes inevitable. The issue, then, is not insufficient love, but insufficient perception. Al-Ghazali described the spiritual journey as a ladder of consciousness. Fear-based worship is governed by the lower self, religion as a mechanism to reduce anxiety. Reward-based worship is governed by the ego. Faith becomes strategic. Love-based worship is governed by the error. The spirit transcending calculation and aligning with self-transcendence at the highest stage. Devotion becomes non-contingent. The believer worships not for paradise but from understanding. As he wrote, "The one who worships for reward has not known God, but his own desire for gain." The transition from moral fear to moral freedom is the soul's true ascension, the essence of loving Allah beyond. Reward is Ikhlas, purity of intention. Al-Ghazali defines sincerity as acting so that no witness remains but God. Psychologically, this means the collapse of self-referential thinking. The mind stops monitoring how it appears or what it gains. During deep awareness, the self quiets, producing presence without calculation. When intention is purified, the act itself becomes intrinsically rewarding. The heart enters flow, attention absorbed, time dissolving, joy arising from the act itself. Paradise is not postponed, it is experienced now, as freedom from the inner calculation of gain. Heaven becomes a state of consciousness, not merely a future geography. How can one love God beyond reward when life is full of suffering? Al-Ghazali's answer: tests expose the true nature of love. If love collapses when comfort disappears, it was never love, it was dependency. He distinguished between loving God's gifts and loving God's wisdom. The first disappears with loss, the second deepens through it. Every event manifests one of God's names: mercy, justice, patience, majesty. What appears as deprivation may express a name we rarely understand. Recognizing this transforms pain into perception. Suffering becomes a mirror for divine meaning rather than a question of fairness. You stop asking, "Why me?" and begin seeing, what truth is this revealing? At first glance, loving God for no reason seems irrational, an act of pure sentiment detached from logic. Yet Al-Ghazali insists that pure love is the most rational form of cognition. It arises from accurate perception of reality. The intellect, when unobstructed by desire, recognizes that the source of existence, beauty, and consciousness deserves love by necessity, not preference. Reason and love are not opposites. They converge when the intellect matures. Knowledge culminates in reverence. Because the highest rational act is acknowledgement of perfection, pure love is not irrational emotion, but perfected understanding. How can these ideas shape contemporary spiritual practice? Become aware of subtle calculations behind devotion. I'll pray so this goes well, or I'll give charity so I'm blessed. Awareness loosens the pattern. Shift from expectation to presence. Direct attention to the intrinsic meaning of the act rather than its outcome. Reflect on divine attributes. Contemplating God's perfection refines love into recognition rather than demand. Cultivate silent devotion. Engage in worship without request. Awareness itself becomes communion. When faith shifts from negotiation to presence, worship becomes not a contract but a state of coherence. The believer moves from anxiety about results to intimacy with reality itself. Can love exist without suffering? Al-Ghazali's answer is yes. Not as an ideal, but as a rational necessity. When knowledge matures into recognition, love ceases to depend on benefit. It becomes the natural response of consciousness to what is ultimately real. Conditional faith seeks paradise. Unconditional faith is paradise because the heart freed from calculation experiences immediate harmony. He who loves Allah for reward seeks a gift. He who loves Allah for Allah is the gift. To love beyond heaven's reward is not to reject paradise, but to realize that its essence already lives within a heart purified of transaction. In that recognition, devotion ceases to be a strategy. It becomes understanding itself.